thank you everyone for joining today in this quite last minute Dialogos. This is something that has been planned for quite a long time. Since April, we actually had a first call, James, Peter, and I, to prepare this session. So this is the first event of a series of live events and interviews that we're going to conduct at the Bouncewell project with experts in leadership, shadow work, body work, polarity work. We have the honor to welcome James Priest, the steward of Sociocracy 3.0, and Peter, that I call the source of source, but I'm not sure this is how he called himself. Okay.
James, I love your ability to articulate things. Came very clearly through in your video that I looked at as well. I think you have a very, very strong gift in expression and articulation with such clarity. How I'd like to respond is to give a little bit of information on the background of what you're calling my inquiry, and related also to your, I think, is you saying that your focus is on behavior patterns. My inquiry started out of curiosity, how founders realize their projects. And it started in, I don't know if you've read this or seen this, it started in Quebec, where I brought a group of founders together, expecting that we would all be manifesting our projects in different kind of ways. And I had 12 founders in the room. And I said, well, I'll describe what I do, and then we'll go around the room and figure out, find out what each of us are doing and compare notes. And after I described what I do normally to realize my project, everybody turned to me and said, well, actually, you've just described what I do. And I was completely flabbergasted. And everybody was flabbergasted by that because, I come out of business school, learning normal management. And I realized that what I just described has never been taught to me anywhere. And we all realize none of us have had any education as entrepreneurs or founders in what we've just described. So at the beginning, I was extremely skeptical. I thought, well, these are just people I've invited them. Maybe they're being nice. So I repeated it. This was in Quebec. 2 weeks later in Brussels, 2 weeks after that in Berlin. And then I found out there's something here that really needs to be brought through, because it's completely different to what our management learning is in any formal setting. That was the start. And so I created what I called Source Days, always inviting founders or entrepreneurs or people working for them to come in and just share experience. Because, I thought what I had described originally was very rough. So over the years, there have been hundreds of source days where what I just started to describe as originally a source, my first attempt was to call it a source hypothesis. After about 11 times, it looked like the same things were coming through. I called it source principles. And then for a very short time, I called it even a source law, because it seemed to have the weight of gravity after a while. But I withdrew, I moved backwards because people don't like hearing things being so dogmatic. So I've called it ever since source principles, and been refining and refining and refining, inviting people at each source day to contradict and tell me that what I'm presenting is wrong. And with time, I've become kind of dogmatic because there is such a wealth of evidence in this, although the invitation has always been to find things wrong, but with a condition that people who find things wrong must bring their own evidence. because I've got so much evidence. I need to have contradictory evidence to see that something is out of place. So, you know, after this was 2009, it went up to 10 years research, if you like, before I came down to a final principle, 26 principles, which were kind of interacting with one another, and corresponded to 3 prime chapters. One is order, an order in organization. The second one is around how collaboration works. And the third one is about succession processes. These are the 3 main chapters. And succession, not just of, you know, one entity, like an enterprise from one person to another person, but within the enterprises as well, within initiatives and projects as well, succession of specific roles. So this is the basis for, you know, with my inquiry, not in terms of a theory, but in, you know, I don't describe what I've done as being preconceived academically. I describe it as being a description which is post-conceived. In other words, we're listening to the experience first, and we're coming to the principles afterwards, which can always be challenged. And of course, they have been challenged. But the interesting thing is, one of the main points being challenged has always been that there's a single source for each project and enterprise. And the main interesting part is that the people that challenge that most are the people who haven't yet founded an enterprise. They're the people who are parts of communities, but are not usually the founders themselves. Because founders themselves usually understand this and are very, very resonant with the ideas. It's very, very rare that we come across a founder who has a major objection. One of the strongest objections was maybe somebody you know, Josh Weil from Inspiral. And
Ex-founder, right?
Well, I don't know. He wouldn't call himself that. That's where I met Fran.
Oh, he did call himself that once upon a time, I remember.
Really?
He told me that he was, yeah, we were at a conference in Sweden, and he opened with saying that he was an ex-founder.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, we had some great battles, and he gave me the compliment saying that this was the best battle he'd ever had.
Okay.
So I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
But he was very strongly against the idea. But this is very rare, actually.
Yeah.
And so just to say, I know that your background before you, or that you have, we share a love of personal development from the past, at least. And I feel that this is very important too for everybody in organizations, and primarily the founder, of course.
Yeah.
And my approach to it, as Timothy knows, is beyond the behavioral. It goes down to the level of identity, because my work, as you may know, I've come from working on the relationship with money to the relationship with everything, and have a system to help people develop and change from where they happen to be. But it's not about changing behavior primarily. It goes to the level of identity, who people see that they are, because that's my belief. That's where actually behavior arises from. So these two things for me go hand in hand. It's like the source work is a description for me of how we as human beings realize our projects. And if changes need to be made, and I'm sure this is the kind of work that you've been doing in organizations, it needs to be done through personal development of the individuals in order to change their behavior and set new patterns for the culture of the entity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, along this, we do have lots of common ground. And I can imagine where we may have potential argument is where I've had it with other people in sociocracy, which is around the idea that we take decisions together, that there is joint decision making, whereas I claim that it is ultimately always the decision of the source that is actually happening, but we can go into that if it's necessary. So I'll stop there, because I think, you know, I've been describing probably a lot of common ground, and maybe an area where we may not quite yet have common ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I pass back or to you, Timothy.
Yes. So where do you want to go, Timothy?
Yeah, just as fascinating to hear you, Peter, and you, James. Many things comes to mind. There is the relationship between culture and structure, and in my view, I feel source is addressing more of the cultural element, and sociocracy may be more of the structure and the tools and the process, even though both also touch on each other. What I also wrote with Peter is that some potential topics for the Dialogos could be talking about this notion of group consciousness and versus individual consciousness. There is also the notion of consent and how potentially source work could, if implemented and complementarily with S3, could help to move from consent to consensus. And yeah, then I talked about the last one was alignment paralysis, a form of spiritual bypassing to justify non-action. I'm not sure in which context this point came, but maybe a last thing I want to put in terms of intention is that what I see and the often the male founders of decentralized purpose-driven organizations is that they struggle to assume their leadership in an explicit way. And you end up with men that develop those kind of hidden and implicit ways of controlling and setting implicit boundaries, and it creates actually very toxic cultures. And my work that I see is really about helping them to assume explicitly in a healthy way their leadership. And this is why it has, I think, so much to do with masculinity. What I've seen a lot, and this is something for Peter, is that I saw people discovering source work, men discovering source work and repressing their leadership, doing the full pendulum swing and becoming a bit tyrant, you know, like, oh, I own the source, and they take the thing, and then they start setting boundaries in a disrespectful way and hurting people and say, I'm the source now, which is maybe a necessary stage. But maybe this is where Sociocracy and S3 could help balance these kind of behaviors with, the wisdom of the team. And yeah, this is why for me it's so essential to have those two tools working together. Yeah.
I'm not one who associates the word sociocracy with doing things together. In fact, I associate the word sociocracy with a non-democratic, the idea of a non-democratic, reasoned-based approach to making and evolving decisions that constrains societies somehow for the benefit of the people. And Comte was somebody who was against the idea of democracy and making decisions together. He thought that it was important that the social scientists and other experts with the help of the scientific method, would be the ones who were making decisions for the society. And so I think this is a very interesting starting point, because when people hear the word sociocracy today, they immediately think doing things together.
Yeah.
And Kant was going quite in the other direction. And actually Gerhard Endenberg also, because he was about distributing responsibilities throughout an organization. And, you know, the way I've translated that and built on that with S3, with Bernard and Lily, is the idea you want to free people up to get on with things as much as possible. It's always an overhead to do anything together. And so the gains need to outweigh the costs. And oftentimes attempts for a more egalitarian approach to collaboration lead to bottlenecks and impediments and ineffectiveness, because people are so fixated on some kind of radically egalitarian approach to working together that they fail to see the merits of putting in place minimal necessary constraints and then leaving people to get on with things. So I'm a big advocate for that. I think that the less we need to do together, the better, but at the same time, we should pay due diligence to moments when some kind of collaborative endeavor will reap greater rewards than were we to attempt things for ourselves. So that's one thing I want to say about that. I'm aware I'm cutting you there, Peter, but it's the underlying thing, just to kind of speak it out, is I wonder about cognitive bias, you know, because when you look through a certain lens over time and you can accrue evidence, like anecdotal evidence, you know, we attract to us people over time who are drawn to the message, drawn to the narrative, and so on. And I know for myself how easy it is to kind of filter everything through a particular lens and use that as a way to, it's like confirmation bias over time. And I'm not saying that you are or are not doing that, right? I'm just aware that that's a thing. And it's
I agree with you.
Yeah.
And the question is, who's got the best cognitive bias for the purpose? Really, ultimately, that's really, I think where I put my money is because we're only dealing with stories ultimately.
Sure. Yeah.
So you know, why I've been inviting contradiction is to try and make sure that we have the most useful story. And if your story can be better than mine, I'll jump onto yours. You know, that's been my approach anyway.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I guess maybe that's a kind of fundamentally different perspective, perhaps, because for me, it's not so much about the right story or the wrong story. It's the right story in the right moment and the right thing in the right moment. And in a way, there's a correlation with S3 there, because all of the patterns in S3 are valuable, but they're valuable in certain cases some of the time. And there's other moments where they're unnecessary, or perhaps even would be detrimental to effectiveness, at least in terms of some organizational endeavor. And so it's not so much that, you know, because I can think of so many examples where your work and your perspective, the little I know of it, you know, and I should read more before we have this exchange so I can be more informed. So I'm you know, speaking from a rather like low resolution understanding of your work, but I can certainly see that, you know, in many of the things I've understood about source, I've seen in those people whom I have seen clearly as source. I'm just questioning the universality of it, or in all cases, all of the time. And I see for you, you know, you've been working with this for many years, and it's that's what you see, and you see it everywhere, and you're of the opinion that that's how it is, and I fully respect that, and you have much more experience of that than me. I just wanted to be transparent about my hesitancy to just jump on that bandwagon entirely and start proclaiming to all and sundry that this is always the case, because I'm not convinced that it's always the case. And certainly in my case right now, I cannot correlate my situation with Bernard with the perspective that you share. But I don't know that this is a dialogue about whether or not your work around source, Peter, is like universally true or not. You know, and I think that's what I'm missing at the end of this conversation a little bit, Timothy, is like the point of the conversation, because it's not to kind of give credit to or critique source work or S3 as far as I understand, but rather it's about providing some exposure to people who are in positions of responsibility, bringing forward ideas into the world and facing many of the typical struggles that come alive around that. And especially with an emphasis on men in a moment where masculinity in general is not seen in such a positive light, at least according to certain kind of amplified narratives, I would say, and that permeates into the consciousness of boys and men. And a lot of guys, mainly guys, are struggling around what it is to be a man in the world today, and especially a man who's in a position of influence or in terms of some kind of initiative that they need to lead in some way and are reliant perhaps on the help of others, maybe many others, in order to be able to realize that, and their struggles with where to draw the line in terms of their kind of authority, you know, as a what, to use your word, Peter, as source of that initiative, and at the same time in which ways and how to involve others. And I think, you know, the S3 offers options for distributing responsibilities and authority to influence throughout organizational systems in a manner that preserves the integrity of the purpose of the organization. Yeah, and there's all kinds of patterns that are going to support that in different ways. And so I see in that respect, you know, a dialogue around the idea of source, the idea of responsibility, the idea of leadership, the idea of collaboration, and the necessity to be able to enroll others and work with others, whilst at the same time navigating that treacherous arena where one doesn't wish to be seen as some kind of dominant dictator and then perhaps disowns somewhat authority and leadership in a moment, and then later one of you was saying how, you know, that can flip on its head and suddenly you've got the tyrant who's dictating to everybody because there wasn't a healthy expression of authority and influence from the beginning, you know. And I think that's where your work, Peter, is probably one of the many benefits that your work is bringing to people, is just helping them to have a sense of entitlement to stand for what it is that they're bringing into the world, and to support them to do that in a way that's in integrity and doesn't lead to just pissing everybody off, to put it bluntly, and finding themselves alone and unable to manifest that idea. You know, I think that's where we're at. And that balance point between collaboration and what's the word?
Direction.
I don't know the word. Sorry?
Direction, I would say, from directive to collaborative.
Yeah, directive to collaborative. Yeah, on that spectrum, and being able to embrace both. Yeah.
So we're here to explore the question of the founder's dilemma. Basically, what collectives I hear around me are struggling with is basically how to hold source in a way that is neither oppressive and tyrannical, nor repressive of oneself and of natural hierarchies. How to master the dance as a leader between truly letting go and protecting what is sacred. How to prevent founders bypassing consent to avoid decision paralysis, but of overriding sound arguments in the process. And behind this question, there's also the question of assessing the level of clarity of a source. Who is responsible for this, and how do we do this?
So what I've viewed over the years with this notion of consent, or with the idea of consent, of course, I was involved pretty early on in, well, if I say early on, in the sociocracy movement. I was particularly involved when Marshall Rosenberg decided to introduce sociocracy into nonviolent communication. And I remember the person, I forget his name now, from the United States came over to try and introduce all the principles of sociocracy into that network. And that's a good, I think, 20 years ago. So I had a sort of first-hand view of this, or sense of this, of what was being done. I don't claim to be a to know it in depth. I also had the benefit of seeing Endenburg make an excellent presentation, Findhorn, on this even before that. But coming to your question, Timothée, on consent, with my source lens, I think the process of consent is an excellent one, but I'm not in agreement with many people in sociocracy or from sociocracy who say then that it is a group taking a decision. Because from with my source lens, what I see is that it is always the founder who is getting the clear information on the next step for an initiative. And what's happening for me in the consent process is that the founder is being challenged on their clarity. And it's at the moment when all the challenges that the founder receives have been integrated or rejected, and the founder is so clear on the next step that the founder just needs to say what needs to happen, and it will happen, because there is, at that moment, everything falls into line. So I've been in a couple of sociocratic processes where that has happened, actually. And it's so clear that when the founder is completely clear, things, they only need to say what needs to happen next, and that the whole thing will move. And there's usually no resistance at that point, which is, in my view, what the consent process actually does. It's just, I have maybe a different lens of viewing what is actually happening at that point. Now, some may say, well, the founder is a tyrant at that point, or a dictator. I prefer the word dictator, because dictator is just if you look at the etymology, it's just saying what needs to happen. And when a founder is clear, they just say what needs to happen next, and it goes into action. So we may come on to discuss the issues of power, but it's a very different sense of power than what is generally thought of as a tyrannical power. So that would be my thing. And you were saying, well, how do you know when the founder is clear? Well, I would say very simply, you feel it. Everybody can feel it.
So I kind of have one question that comes to mind here, in terms of even when it would make sense for a founder to override an argument that qualifies as an objection in the way I'm referring to it. And if I just kind of remind you of what I mean by objection, an argument that demonstrates how proceeding in a certain way will lead to consequences that are detrimental, considering the purpose of the organization. An argument that demonstrates exposure to risk, at least, that is untenable, concerning the purpose of the organization, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve whatever it is that's being proposed or currently done in that organization, meaning worth taking the time and effort to make a change somehow. In my understanding, whether you're a founder, source, whomever in an organizational system, when there's an argument that you can understand demonstrates one or other of these things, it's worth considering in any case. And if the domain of a founder is clear, the limits to which others are able to exercise authority and influence concerning the domain of that founder, then that domain is kind of the integrity of that domain can be preserved, but the founder or source, or whichever term you wish to use, will have the benefit of tapping into the distributed cognition and intelligence of the people whom they are collaborating with to harness the value when arguments emerge that prove to qualify as objections, because in any case, this is always going to be worthwhile.
First of all, I'm curious, but please don't reply to this because I want to lead on to the other things. But I'm curious, in your view, you know, if somebody raises an objection which is considered invalid in your system, how do you deal with that? But that's just a question, because you would have to override in some kind of way an invalid question, and somebody would have to do that. But what I want to respond, which is actually more controversial than my question, is that from a source perspective, organizations don't have purpose other than the purpose of the founder. So the organization's purpose is the purpose of the source. And now I'm sure there's going to be strong objection to that, but that does kind of put away a lot of the things that you've been saying if you work with that particular lens. Because it's not just so much a question of overriding other people. It's a question of everybody understanding and acknowledging to start off with, that sources do have the ultimate knowledge of the fields that they have created, or the ultimate, let's say, responsibility and authority and power over their particular creations. And that goes also for what we call the global source. In other words, the person who's created the first field. So that actually, the very notion that somebody should know better than the source is a wrong notion from the very start if you're working with a source lens. So the object of everybody in the field is to help everybody else help everybody become clear. And your example, if I may say, James, is probably showing up a source who was acting out of fear and not clear at that moment in saying, 3 months, this conference needs to be put on. If at that point a source is not clear and actually insists for whatever reason, and it's usually a fear-based reason, and goes ahead, insists on going ahead, they're going to get the kind of consequences that you suggest. And what happens there, and we have so many examples of this that we could share, what happens is usually a waste of time, a waste of energy, and a waste of money, which is why one of the source principles is that you don't take a decision and you don't take any action until you're 100% clear. 95% is not enough. 100% is necessary to be clear. And that's the difficulty for most founders or most sources, is that actually we're all under pressure to take decisions, take actions most of the time. And most of the time, and I say 80% of the time, we're actually in doubt, not clear. And that's part. Have we lost James?
Yeah, he's coming back. Just continue.
Okay. So I'll just wait, because it's an interesting moment. He's disappeared.
And then I will just invite all of us to just take a moment and pay attention
and
to
breathe. Yeah.
So far, and just like, what does this invoke within you and between us. So it's a beautiful moment for some presence. Hi, James. We waited for you.
Yeah, we paused, James. We used this to pause.
Thank you so much. My son called me and somehow it cut the sound. So
okay. Yep. So what I was just. Oops, has he gone again?
No, I hear you.
Are you here? Oh, there you are. Yeah, I can see. So what what we suggest, or I suggest very strongly with source principles, is that actually most of the time we sources are not clear. And I suggest at least 80%. And it's amazing. You know, the source days I've run, you know, more than 100 source days, and the practitioners like Tom have run so many. The moment we acknowledge the fact that we're not clear as sources, it's amazing. This is usually the high point in the presentation, because everybody feels, you know, so often as founders that we need to be clear, we ought to be clear. And you say, look, most of the time we're not, and there's this big sense of relief. But the point is that, you know, don't take a decision until you're clear, because it's going to be a bad decision. And what we need to do is we need to get all the information, including from the other people in your sort of consent process, and more research whatever's necessary outside the group to finally come to our decision. And that's why I say sometimes that being a founder or being a source is a full-time job, without wanting to do it, without getting into the operations at all. Because some of these decisions are so fine and so hard to take that they take a long time and they take a lot of energy to have this kind of clarity. So, you know, I think I leave it there, because I think that's maybe one of the main points that we would be actually discussing here.
I would like to maybe go a bit further in that question. And what I've been seeing sometimes is actually sources acting out, thinking they're clear. And this is what I'm talking about. Is like, who decides of the clarity of the source?
Well, the source is going to
the level of clarity. Yeah.
So the source is going to make mistakes, like you're describing, thinking they're clear and they're not clear. So when that happens, it's fantastic. That's a great learning process, because things are not going to work out as they expected. So they have a step to take at that point in their own personal development. And those that are working as my practitioners are not allowed to be practitioners in my field until they have learned to do what we call reclamation work. In other words, to help sources to go through this step of personal development where such a situation occurs.
So the source should know better than anyone else how to pursue that, or to deal with the conflict. Okay, so what specifically are you referring to in terms of no one knows better?
You see, each source has their specific creation, and therefore responsibility for their creation. Mm-hmm. So you know, we have an order in in the field, what I'm calling the field, where there are people have got their various creations as specific or subsources. So I
understand. Yeah.
So each one knows what the process of realization is in a series of steps. And so each source, specific source, is looking at what's the next step to realize my particular vision in my particular field. And that's what I'm referring to as
I understand. And so from your perspective, no one knows better than that individual in the context of that particular domain, right?
Genau.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. I see. And so back to your question, Timothy, which is the one that led to this particular area of inquiry to begin with, was around how or when to know when a source kind of goes too far or in the wrong direction, or exceeds the scope of their kind of domain in terms of what it is that they're stewarding. And I would still come back then to the point that listening to arguments of other people, other sources, let's say, Peter, sub-sources, if you like, throughout the system, when they bring wisdom based on their own past experience and expertise, or perhaps just a perspective that is currently unavailable to that source, when those arguments demonstrate how proceeding in a particular way will lead to negative consequences concerning the aspirations of that source, then that's always going to be a worthwhile argument to consider. And I can't conceive of any moment when a source might say, despite the fact you've argued clearly and I understand and others understand that this argument demonstrates negative consequences to proceed in this way, I will do it regardless. It doesn't, I just can't conceive of a moment when any person would do that.
Well, I have quite a number of examples where that's happened. For example, the first one that comes to mind is a firm of solar panel makers, where there was the source got an idea of another technology, and all the people were highly resistant to that. And if the source hadn't insisted or hadn't proceeded the way he intended, the company would have gone out of business.
Fair enough. And what was the actual argument that they were bringing forth, besides the fact they were resistant to it?
Well, I wasn't in the argument. I wasn't in the process itself, but because we were looking actually at a whole other question there around succession. But what I understood, from the history, they were describing the history, how it precisely, the people were not thought that what I understood, the people thought the new technology was far too risky. It was a big risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting opinion, but it's not an argument, you see. And so if we're adopting the principle of consent and utilizing the concept of objection, an objection is an argument that demonstrates clearly, unequivocally, to all of those who are responsible for whatever happens next, that proceeding in that way will lead to consequences that would better be avoided, exposure to risks that would better be avoided or prefer to be avoided, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve. So in my experience, people are very adept at sharing their opinions, but opinions are opinions. They don't count when we're playing the game of consent. What we're looking for is arguments that are tested through the distributed cognition and intelligence of others to see whether or not there is anything of value there that can help everybody to have a better day, including the source. And so, yeah, they might well have thought, oh, it's risky and so on and so forth. But in the absence of understanding what their actual argument was and were that to qualify or not, we can't really derive from that whether or not consent and would have been suitable in that case, and whether or not they actually had an argument that qualified as an objection to begin with.
Okay.
And just to finish, just to come back to maybe a more concrete example of the founder I spoke about with the conference. People had clear arguments that without compromising their time with their families, their health and well-being, to pursue the realization of a conference within 3 months would lead to some people burning out, would lead to excessive workload, and would diminish the quality of other work that the organization was already committed to with its customers. They were clear arguments, they were standing, and the pursuit of that conference proved that to have been the case. And retrospectively, everybody understood that a longer timeline would have been suitable in that case. This was a situation where a source was right, let's say, overrode common sense that was emergent among the people, and it led to various negative consequences that cost the organization dearly. And so this is the reason I bring that example, is because it's such a clear one. It's in no way suggesting that the source could not pursue the realization of the conference. It was simply about taking a more systemic perspective, and other sources throughout that organization arguing that pursuing that particular timeline was going to be detrimental to the integrity of the organization, to the individuals in it, and the quality of their ability to deliver value to their existing customers and fulfill their existing requirements.
So my question here would be, how do you decide what is an opinion and what is an argument? First of all, how do you make that, in your meetings here, you have this group of people, and you're saying some of them are making opinions and some of them are making arguments, and how do you know that the source was clear at that point? I come to Timothy's question. You're assuming that the source was clear. How do you judge that the source was clear when he made that bad decision?
Well, once again, you touch on to probably the most complicated, I would say, rather than complex, but certainly complicated areas of decision making. And for that, there's also a need to understand the pattern testing arguments qualify as objections. And maybe that's something for the Q&A. I could summarize that briefly. But the pattern itself utilizes distributed intelligence to check for any disagreement with the argument. And in the case that there's a disagreement, that disagreement is heard. And once again, there's a check to see if there's any disagreement with the disagreement, and so on and so forth, until arriving at a point where there's a clear argument to which nobody disagrees. And I see a comment here from Fanny in the chat. Fanny is saying, if you only act from rational arguments, won't you only take action that never goes beyond the Einstein quote, we cannot solve problems from the same level of thinking that created them? And I think that's a common conclusion. Yes, Pamela.
Before you go there, before you
Yeah.
go there, sorry for interrupting you. I try to find a good spot for interrupting. I would like to just to share. I'm aware of that there is a heightened intensity in the field in the conversation, and I see that as really good, because I have a word for it, and it calls creative friction. And it is like when two perspectives is like going like in a way against each other, and we're holding a polarity. And if we can hold a polarity long enough, there is a third perspective that can come forward. But sometimes, for be able to hold it without rupturing or going into a sense of like rushness or distress, I just want to invite for just like a moment of space, like just a moment of like slowing down, bringing in a deeper quality of presence into the conversation, just allowing a bit more space before we respond, and like really bringing in playfulness and curiosity and openness. And I'm just going to check before I move on and let you back in, James. Are there more people in the room that had a sense of the heightened intensity in the conversation? Can you like show a hand or something, or wave or something? Okay, just to give me like a confirmation that I was not totally off in my sensing. So with that, I think this is such an like interesting moment. That when creative friction comes on board, for me, that's the moment in a conversation, in a Dialogos. So I invite everyone in the space to take just like pay attention to bring in more space around this part of the conversation, like to expand to what is the perspective that wants to come forward in this, that what it looks like two polar perspective. Maybe it isn't, but that's how it looks like right now. So before anyone takes the word again, I will just like invite for at least 20 seconds of silence, just to allow us to create that space together before we move on. Thank you for taking the invitation. I appreciate it. And I'm giving all of you just to pay attention to Monty's perspective in the chat, and give it another 10 seconds and then move on in the conversation, in the dialogue, wherever it wants to be moved on. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. We're entering the Q&A time. I'm gonna let James finish his what he started, and then we'll move into the questions.
Thank you, Timothy and Pamela. And absolutely, I was aware of the tension too, Pamela. And we often say around S3, tension is a symptom of wisdom seeking emergence. And when there's conflict, steer towards it, but steer toward it in a sophisticated and structured way. I'm in no dispute as a founder of S3, well, actually a co-founder of S3, but that's a conversation for another time. And having worked with many founders, I'm fully aware, Peter, of many of the dilemmas you're laying out and the perspective you're sharing. I adhere to the fact that if somebody has a clear vision of something that needs to emerge, then it's important that they work to preserve the realization of that so far as they're able at any cost. So I'm not in dispute with this. It's more, as this co-founder explained last week, it wasn't the vision of this person for the conference that was the issue. The thing that was contested was the approach. And it's clear to anyone looking, and this, by the way, this person wasn't acting out of fear, as you suggested they might have been, but they were acting out of excitement and inspiration and a longing to realize something. But I wanted to just address, and perhaps this moves us into the Q&A anyway. Fanny, you mentioned that if you're only up from rational arguments, won't you only take action that never goes beyond the Einstein quote, you can't solve problems from the same level of thinking that created them. But an argument that qualifies as an objection need not be empirically demonstrable. Perhaps, Pamela, you're our resident psychic, and you have a history of sharing things that others can't see. And in a moment, you might speak up and say, hey, folks, I know there's no evidence to support this, but I really have a sense that moving in this direction is going to lead us toward consequences that we would rather avoid. And I can't say any more about it than that right now. If historically, we know that you have a track record of being pretty on point with something like this, then among the group of stakeholders involved, there might well be no disagreement with that argument, and therefore it would qualify as an objection just as much as an argument that is empirically and statistically demonstrable. And the reason I'm laboring on this point is to understand that subtlety around consent. It's not just about rationality. There's space for intuition, for felt sense, for that which cannot be demonstrated explicitly. But it's a way, as you invited at the beginning, I forget exactly your words, Pamela, but you know, how we come together into this space as something that comes alive because we're together in this moment, you know, something that's greater than any one of us, or you know, the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. This was Rumi, right? Beyond right and wrongdoing, there's a field I'll meet you there. And so I think it's important to just understand that on this topic of consent, I have many problems with various interpretations of that approach to decision making. But in the context of S3, we're simply encouraging people to tap in to the potential that lies distributed among individuals, not to compromise people's domain of authority, and in the case of a source, their authority to move ahead with realizing the vision as they so wish to do, but rather in the means of how to go about achieving that, to be open to listen to arguments that can demonstrate worthwhile ways to improve and to avoid potential impediments that a source or anyone else may currently be unconscious of or failing to perceive. So I'll leave it there.
Great. So I'm going to invite Philippe to ask his question. Philippe, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm in a public space, so I will try not to speak too loud. But for me, the sense of what you differ upon that for Peter, there is one that's opening a field, and the other person contributing to the development of the field. And I see from James' perspective, there can really be two sources, meaning several people developing and creating and developing a field. Is there a space where your two visions can meet, or is there a basic divergence on that specific point?
I'm very happy to respond to that. The way I see vision, people's visions, is that they are incredibly intimate, personal things. So very often we have experiences of so-called co-founders who claim to have the same vision, which for me would be a kind of miracle, receiving the exact same information at the very same moment. And very often, what we see with co-founders in that who believe that is that they can, write down, for example, what that vision is. But then at some point while they're realizing it, one of them says to the other, well, I thought we meant this. And the other one says, no, I thought we meant that. So this experience has been so frequent that for me, the vision is a very, very personal and intimate thing, which you receive, and it's in all your cells. It doesn't come through your mind. It's coming in your mind and in every part of you. So the source work looks at how every person in the field can realize their own personal vision. And this is really the key, because it's almost a paradox. When this works, everybody is realizing their personal vision, and there's a feeling of collectivity at that moment, which is a very rare feeling. You see this, people like to call themselves groups or teams, but actually most of the time they're just bunches of individuals. And when you have a collective really working, everybody is like in an orchestra. Everybody's playing their instrument, focused on their instrument, playing their instrument, and some collective magic is actually happening at that moment. And nobody's trying to pretend, the trumpeter is not trying to pretend that they know better how to play, telling the violinist what to do. It would be a joke. So that's how I perceive visions and the relationship between visions. And it happens in an orchestra, but it also happens in a jazz combo in a completely different way. But there's always a source there who is in taking the lead, a global source. That's my perspective. And let me just add on, it is also, I acknowledge it's my cognitive bias. And I'm very happy for this cognitive bias. And I will change it if I discover one which is even better than this one.
Perhaps the last thing here is that, because we met once before, Peter, we haven't spoken much.
Yeah.
I've not dove greatly into source. And I said to Timothy before the call, I'm not here to argue the legitimacy of your claim or not. What's important for me in the invitation around how S3 patterns can support source work is to clarify to people that our ancestors have learned many ways of working together toward their objectives, whatever those objectives might be, however they're defined and by whoever. And therefore, I don't see this as an either or question, but simply as an opportunity for founders who are looking to develop an organization, and whether that's to realize a vision or respond to a clear user need, to be informed of the fact that there are practices, processes, and guidelines that can be really supportive toward those ends. And in moments of challenge, when the current approach fails to bring about the results they expect or wish to see, they might wish to look to S3 patterns or anything else out there, whether that's liberating structures or nonviolent communication or whatever your preferred options of choice, to be open to the possibility of continuous learning, occasionally unlearning, and harnessing the value that we together can generate far beyond that which any one of us can achieve alone.
So, it looks like we're coming up to slowly towards closing time. So my sort of overseeing of this is that I think the tension is still there to a good degree. And it has to do with, I sense a kind of denial of the individual in what you are claiming, James. It's like the kind of denial of the individual role. You're saying, we have a generally people have a general need, and then an organization forms. And there's, in that statement, there's a kind of denial of, well, who's going to actually take the step? Or is there an individual who takes a step? And what I'm saying is, yes, there's always one individual who takes the step to initiate something and do something. It just doesn't sort of emerge amongst sort of a group of people like this. And if you look at the anthropology, I think we'll see, amongst the indigenous peoples, there's always, a leader handing down something. Now, I'm not denying that needs to be the case for the future. I'm not denying that we couldn't have a different kind of organizational form in this future, and that the source work, what I'm suggesting is source work, may be superseded. On the contrary, I think it will be superseded at some time. I don't know when, but I've had enough experiences, unusual experiences, like I've been in the presence of somebody who took a coin from a stranger and was able to bend it like Uri Keller. This is unexplainable how somebody does that. Obviously, it has something to do with energy. Maybe Pamela can do that sort of thing. I'm not sure. Bending forks. I've also had the experience of being in Quebec with somebody with a whole bunch of machines without any cables to them, and was with his mind was able to get these machines running. And there were people, engineers with galvanometers, trying to figure out how this worked. They weren't able to figure out what was happening. So I do believe, I am open to these sort of things, different kinds of developments. But I do take exception to people who pretend that they're already there when they're far away from it. And that's why I like my cognitive bias for the moment, because I think it's, where we share, what the path we share, James, is the question of utility. And I do believe that that what we're doing is very useful. It seems to have empirical results. I imagine you're saying the same thing, and therefore, I totally accept to use NVC, Enneagram, intuition, or everything should be used, in my view. Everything should be used where it's useful. But I would take exception to the notion that initiatives are not started by an individual, and I'll stay with that. That would be my conclusion. Initiatives at the moment that are actually realizing something in the world, at the moment, they're not started with groups. We're not at that level of consciousness yet, except in maybe some very, very exceptional situations. But generally speaking, the organizations, the companies, the communities that we're seeing in the world, that's not the case at the moment. And I do take exception to that suggestion. So that would be my conclusion, Timothy, for the day, for the moment, whether it leads to tension or not.
And Timothy, next time let's have 3 hours, mate, because no time at all, is it, for something like this? It barely started.
Yeah, it's just a starter. Actually, there is Nadia who's holding a space from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. CET. So in half an hour, if some of you want to continue, you're more than welcome. Peter, I don't know if you have a link that you can share in the chat. I would like to thank everyone for their participation. First, Peter and James for stepping in. I think it's an important conversation that is not sufficiently addressed. And so, yeah, thank you for your presence and engagement today. Thank you, Pamela, for your presence and your interventions. Always on point. And also I want to thank Sinue also for helping me a bit with the tech. And thank you everyone for joining and taking part into this experiment. That will be the first one of a longer list. So
And thank you, Timothy, for taking the initiative and gathering us in the room in such an important distinction and discernment and the possibility for more consciousness around it. Thank you.
My pleasure. So, yeah, everyone, I wish you a beautiful evening.
Thanks, everyone.